Thank you. So, this morning we'll start with a good hour of plenary and then we'll move into breakout group discussions. I promised you yesterday that I would try to find out how many people have been watching us online, and about 500 people have been viewing the webcast. So that's quite good, I think. Just a bit of practical information before we get started. Everyone who was funded by the IPCC to come here should go and see Varani to sign off on their presence. Everyone else who got funding from other sources to get here should also go and see Varani to declare who paid for your ticket, and you can write to Varani as well. You don't need to go and see her right now. But the IPCC needs to declare all the support they got for this meeting, and that includes travel, etc. Also, in the breakout groups, I understand that all the co-chairs are sitting in breakout group A, and your input is also wanted and appreciated in other breakout groups. So if you could consider just spreading out, that would be helpful for group B, C, and D. If you could consider that. We're not going to do a full recap of day one because we did that yesterday afternoon, but I would like to give you an opportunity if you feel that there are big overarching issues that we haven't discussed or that haven't been discussed in the breakout groups. If you would like to raise those here and now without going into detail, there is an opportunity to do that. Jean-Pascal, I need some help with microphones.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. It's a very simple idea which might be useful in improving the way the IPCC summary for policymakers are understood, and that's could be a recommendation from this meeting that the summary for policymakers are made shorter. I strongly believe they are too long. And if they were shorter, they would probably be more readable as well. I mean, they need to be shorter and more readable, but shorter is a key element. Over time, the length of SPMs has increased, and you know, there is a longer version of an intermediate text between the full report and the SPM, and that's the technical summary. We have a long version available for those who want the details. But both for citizens and policymakers, and after all, policymakers are citizens as well, I think a shorter SPM would be much better. Okay. So if that could be considered in
Thank you. The length of the SPM. I think that's a topic for breakout group A. Stuart?
I was kind of reflecting overnight of the sort of discussions that we've had, and a lot of the conversations around detail of, but also I think there may be a point to communicate the purpose of AR6 or other new works, because I think there's probably an expectation outside of groups that know, well actually you've had 5 of them, you should have got it by now. I think there's probably a need for some clarity of purpose, and that probably helps the writing, but maybe thinking about other audiences' expectations, because there may be an expectation that, oh, we've got it, that led to Paris, oh, we're okay.
Okay, clarity on purpose of AR6. Thank you. Per Espen? Oh, sorry.
Co Barrett, Vice Chair, IPCC. I haven't yet heard any conversation about how some of these recommendations might need to influence the actual schedule of the way that we produce the reports. You know, often our schedule is driven by external factors. We want to deliver the synthesis report before this COP meeting or whatever. But in reality, if we're going to embed communications functions more deeply into the production of the reports from the very start, we need to make sure then that we don't shorten the period during which the authors respond to comments, for example, because we'll want to have some time to massage the wording as we spit that out for the next iteration of the report. So just the consideration of providing for enough time to internalize communication messages.
Okay. The scheduling and internalization of communication. Thank you. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Then I will introduce the first speaker this morning, which is John Cook, and we're very happy that he could come and also that he would want to present. John Cook, who probably most of you know, he's a research fellow at the University of Queensland, but he's also the founder and director of Skeptical Science. So please, John.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. Yesterday, Susan Hassel gave a great quote, which I immediately tweeted. There's a science of science communication, and we should use that. So what I'm going to just talk about briefly today is the science of science communication, and in particular, the psychological research into misinformation and how to address misconceptions and myths. Now, the IPCC is a powerful, I guess, it's one of the most impactful examples of science communication, climate science communication out there. And that means that there's also a number of attempts to undermine the impact that the IPCC has. Now, this slide, is it not working? So how do we do this? Is this thing control the PowerPoints? Great. Now, this slide shows mainstream media articles that were published by conservative mainstream media outlets in the weeks leading up to the release of the Working Group 1 report of AR5, the Fifth Assessment Report. And so what this shows is about 27 articles published over 17 days criticising climate science, criticising the IPCC before the report even came out. It's quite extraordinarily prolific. I think even Susan Hassel would be impressed with that level of media coverage, I think. And that was in 2013. Now, this analysis is by UK scientists Constantine Boussalis and Travis Cohen. They've done content analysis on hundreds of thousands of blog posts and conservative publications right up to the end of 2015, the end of last year. And they've sorted the arguments that these articles publish into either criticisms of climate science or criticisms of climate policy. Now, common expectation is that as the science strengthens, as we've seen the statements in the IPCC reports get stronger over the last decade and a half, you would expect that the public debate should be shifting from questioning the science to policy questions. But we've actually seen the opposite effect in the output from contrarian groups. The proportion of arguments criticising the science has actually been on the increase relative to arguments against policy. So this really brings us to the question, what should be the IPCC response to these kind of arguments and misinformation that's undermining climate science? Should they focus on just communicating the science, or should they also address misconceptions and misinformation that's attempting to undermine public, I guess, climate literacy? Now, I'm going to argue that there's two lines of research that I guess provide strong arguments that we do need to address misconceptions. The first is there's a number of studies that have been published that look at the role of, or the impact of misinformation. Now this slide comes from an upcoming study from Yale University that ran an experiment that had two experimental interventions, amongst others. In one of them, they presented information about the scientific consensus on climate change, and they found that this is the bar on the left. It had a strong effect in increasing acceptance of climate change. They also presented an intervention where there was consensus information, but also misinformation casting doubt on the consensus. And what they found was the accurate science information was completely cancelled out by the misinformation. It had no effect. And the implication of this research is that even if we craft the perfect piece of science communication, we get all our words right, we get the uncertainty language perfect, we have all the communication experts in the room and helping us craft the perfect piece of explanation of climate science, that can be undone by misinformation. Now, this work has been replicated by other studies. There was a special issue of Topics in Cognitive Science published just over the last week on the psychology of climate change. That included a study by Aaron McCright that found that different framings, positive framings of climate change, their effect was lessened or undermined by misinformation. And another study by Mike Ranney from Berkeley found that just a few pieces of misleading information, just like a couple of statistics, also can significantly lower people's acceptance of climate change. So there's a danger, there's a risk in failing to address misconceptions and myths. But on a more positive side, there's also an educational opportunity in taking this approach. Now, several decades of educational research have found that lessons that explicitly refute misinformation or misconceptions achieve significantly higher learning gains than just lessons that simply explain the science. And there's other range of benefits to this approach as well, including increasing critical thinking skills, students being more engaged with the content. And so it's not just a matter of considering addressing misconceptions as a necessary evil. There's also positive educational opportunities in this approach as well. So, I think that it's imperative that we do address misconceptions, but there's also a danger in doing that, in that if you don't do it properly, you can actually risk reinforcing myths and misconceptions. One example is the way that AR5 handled the hiatus issue. Hunter was talking about that yesterday. When you adopt a meme, like the denialist meme that global warming had stopped, that there was a hiatus, by adopting that in the language of the AR5, it ran the risk of actually reinforcing that meme. Another example is when your headline includes the word sun and most of global warming, that runs a risk of people coming away with the impression that the sun is causing most of global warming. So there needs to be thought into the actual way the information is structured and the way even headlines are worded. There's a lot of psychological research that provide guidelines into how to approach this. While there's a lot of, I guess, psychological booby traps to be aware of, the research, when you summarise it, provides clear and fairly straightforward guidelines on how to structure science communication, particularly when misconceptions are involved. Now, just very briefly, I'll just run through the three key elements to an effective refutation. And the most important thing is still always communicating the science in a clear, compelling, concrete manner. And really that's what the whole purpose of this meeting is about how can we communicate IPCC science in a clear, simpler, more compelling way. But that alone isn't sufficient. There also needs to be an explanation or an explicit refutation of specific misconceptions that undermine understanding of the climate science. So when myths or misconceptions are mentioned, there needs to be an explicit warning, whether that's in textual form or using visual cues, which puts people cognitively on guard before you tell them about the actual myth. And then lastly, you need to explain the fallacies or the techniques that misinformation uses. That allows people to reconcile myths that they hear with the facts, with the science that you've explained. So just wrapping up briefly, I guess the recommendations I would have from the point of view of someone who does psychological research into misinformation is that tackling misconceptions and myths should be viewed as an educational opportunity. And I think it's important that the IPCC do explicitly address this in some of their published content. In doing that, it's imperative that they do adopt the guidelines from psychological research. And I think that an effective way to do that would be through the physical scientists writing the content, collaborating with social scientists who have expertise in the psychology of misinformation. So yeah, if we have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes, thank you, John. I have Chris and I have, yeah, well, let's start there and then, okay, we'll start with Chris and then.
Thanks. I wonder if you could say a few things about the value that comes from having different kinds of communicators with the myth-breaking perspective, and in the context of the IPCC in particular, do you think it's important that the myth countering come from the IPCC, or is it better if it appears to be and is actually coming from voices outside of the IPCC operations?
Okay, sorry, John. I have quite a few people who want to make comments and questions, so I think we'll just do them and then you can respond at the end. Thank you.
Good morning. John, just a quick question. Has anybody ever studied how prevalent this kind of misconception is outside the Anglo-Saxon climate skeptic world of US, Canada, and Australia? You're better than Australia, right?
Andreas?
Thank you. Is it on? Okay. John, what would you say is the role of the frequently asked questions in the IPCC? Would you say that could do some of what you're recommending or not, or what more needs to be done there?
I have Jim and Nick.
Okay, it's a quick question about the nature of scepticism and the kind of arguments that are deployed. Because in the UK, for example, the scepticism about the physical science is not featuring very strongly. It's actually shifting now to a much more the Bjorn Lomborg position that climate change is real, but it's not worthwhile doing anything about it. There's an even stronger argument that's coming out that some of the companies are lining up around, is that it's actually immoral to take ambitious climate change action because you're inhibiting people's rights to development and economic advances. Could you comment? I mean, that's a much more difficult one in my mind to deal with than the skepticism about the physical science. So comments on that would be great.
And Nick.
So, two quick questions. One, have you done a follow-up since Mr. Abbott went away?
A follow-up of what?
Pardon?
A follow-up of...
Well, I don't know. Has it changed since the government changed? And the other question I had was, I mean, this begs the question again, which is, goes around and around and around. Why is it that the Anglo-Saxon world has this deep embedded sense of competition, combativeness over information, which on one level can be healthy, on another level with climate change is often unhelpful. Yeah.
Thank you. John, would you like to respond?
Okay, so Chris asked, where should these kind of, I guess, reputations come from? And I think that's a good question that's worth discussing. My sense is that, like, when you're, I guess, releasing this science material, it's kind of, you're kind of putting your baby out into the world, and it's kind of defenseless if it's not, I guess, wrapped in this sort of inoculating explanation. So to me, I think that combining science explanations with explanations of myths that are related to that particular science is a natural way to do it, and it's not a huge change to the content. Like coming back to the role of FAQs, it's almost doing that anyway. The FAQs are often addressing questions or misconceptions in people's minds. So I think that the IPCC reports are almost there anyway. It just really needs to look at how that content is designed, and FAQs are a perfect vehicle to do that. So there was a question about other countries. It is true that in the Anglo countries, all those media articles that I showed were from America, Australia, Canada, and England, and so and those countries do have lower levels of climate literacy or acceptance of climate change compared to the rest of the world. Why that is I think a question of ongoing debate. I think it's probably no coincidence that Murdoch media is prominent in those countries more than other countries, and there's a bit of a correlation there. So I think that's probably a factor. But there's other complicated psychological factors or cultural factors in those countries as well. There was a question about policy. Like I think there was that argument, like the Lomborg style arguments, or the argument that the poor need coal or they need fossil fuels, and that is a harder argument to counter than there's no greenhouse effect or attacking the carbon cycle, which are much more straightforward. As the data showed, although like we would expect that there is a shift towards those policy arguments, it's not happening yet. Like I'm expecting every day for those curves to change and for people to shift towards the policy arguments, and they are there, but more prevalent are arguments against the science. So I think we need to do both, but we can't neglect the arguments against the science. That hasn't stopped yet. Is there any change in Australia? It hasn't been that long since we changed prime ministers, and while our current prime minister is more accepting of climate science, under his watch also the Australian climate science community is under serious threat just over the last few weeks, with the whole climate modelling community in Australia under serious threat from job losses. So saying the right things is not necessarily translating to action in Australia. So there is still issues there. I think that addressed all the questions, hopefully to their satisfaction.
I have one more question from Richard.
Hi, thanks, John. Asher Minson, Tyndall Centre for Future Earth Europe. I'm from the University of East Anglia, and so probably we have more experience of being in literally in the rifle sites of scepticism than any other institute on the planet, even the IPCC. And I'm also aware that I'm fairly sort of positive about what I would consider public engagement with climate change, public understanding of climate change, and mostly I see that people are behind it, open to the ideas, and I sort of have some sensitivity with some of the sort of rhetorical terms you're using, like myth, for example. A myth is a sort of cultural, long-standing topic that people have yet to be settled. So I think sort of some of the rhetoric of using things like myths kind of does disservice to science communication, because we're not really talking about myths or the existence of God or anything. So so some of these things, but sorry to keep it short. I mean, in skepticism, misinformation, I mean, how many people is it that you actually want to be completely signed up to climate science when you would be happy that there was no need to be sort of battling skeptics anymore? I mean, what is your what is your level of performance for when you would think this is fine, this is enough people that climate science has done a good job of communicating its science?
I mean, it's
Okay, we'll take Richard and Soraya, and then we'll sum up.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Jim's point, because I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's a big problem here for the whole community, not for the IPCC itself, but people that work with the IPCC. I'd be interested in your views in this, because obviously, you know, going back to 2009, it was the kind of golden era of, you know, what you might call sort of orthodox climate denial or climate skepticism. You know, the science is wrong. But we have kind of moved on from there. And I've had a feeling for some time that the kind of institutions that grew up to fight that haven't moved on as well. And interestingly, we're still thinking about climate change as being predominantly the physical science of climate change. You know, arguably the most important bit of AR5 is the sort of scenarios for how you do the low carbon transition that are in working group 3. And I completely agree. There is no infrastructure outside there. There's no equivalent to John Cook, as far as I know, no equivalent to DSMOG, for example, that's actually working on this aspect, that's actually seen, if you like, enough that the sort of real battleground has moved on. So I'd be kind of interested in your perspective on that, really.
Thank you.
Hi, Suraj Desai, University of Leeds. John, I wonder whether you could comment a little bit on how, you know, myth busting squares up with uncertain science. And I guess the example being, the IPCC, tries to craft statements very carefully around uncertainties. And I could see how, for example, you could try to destroy myths around anthropogenic climate change, because the IPCC says it's virtually certain it's anthropogenic. But then there's a raft of other things that have much more lower confidence. So, for example, how is the climate going to change in Oslo? We have a lot less confidence about how that's going to change. So, how far can you really go with myth busting when actually experts may disagree, even within the IPCC, even within a chapter, in trying to actually describe how much uncertainty there is?
Thank you.
So to answer Ash's question, I guess, like, what is the level that is acceptable? I mean, it's kind of asking how long is a piece of string, in a way. I think that it's important to identify who the target audience is, and I think, according to the psychological research, it's not changing the minds of that tiny minority of the public who reject the science, because, as Susan was saying yesterday, presenting evidence to that group either has no effect or can be counterproductive. So the key audience really is the undecided majority, who are open to evidence but are also vulnerable to misinformation. And so I think that the approach that I'm advocating is really inoculating the undecided majority against the influence of misinformation. So I'm not answering your question at all, because I don't really, really it's just about what is that public tipping point where there's enough public support to make leaders act. That's really a political question that I couldn't address. Richard kind of echoed other sentiments about the debate moving on. And I think that what the data tells us is that public levels of climate literacy are still haven't moved on. There's still confusion about whether climate change is happening or whether humans are causing it. Those basic fundamental questions that the IPCC solved a long time ago. And what the data presented today shows is that misinformation is having an effect in countering the science that we're communicating and depressing public levels of climate literacy, and seeing the output from conservative groups and from contrarian blogs. We see where that's coming from. So I think that the like you mentioned, institutions such as Skeptical Science that are continuing to address this issue. I think the issue is still alive. I think it would be premature to start waving a mission accomplished banner on the topic of climate science.
I wasn't suggesting that. I was suggesting that there is another big fight out there with institutions such as your own. It doesn't seem to have any equivalent in that. It doesn't seem to have any equivalent.
So addressing more working group 3 kind of questions. I guess is what you're saying. And absolutely, I think that totally there needs to be responses to the arguments that against climate policy as well. And then lastly, the question of uncertainty. I think like that's really important, is that we identify areas of science that are well understood versus areas that aren't as well understood. And when we address misconceptions or myths, that we're working in areas that are well understood, like it needs to be. And most of the arguments against the climate science are on fundamental issues like the greenhouse effect or the carbon cycle or just climate sensitivity. Well, that's maybe a bit less well understood than the carbon cycle or attribution. But yeah, I think that it is important to have a discussion on what is the scientific understanding, and that we're on solid ground. That that sticky fact, that science that we communicate needs to be rock solid in order to refute myths related to it.
I'll allow one last comment from Jonathan Lynn, since he's organizing the meeting.
Thank you. Yeah, I just just trying to relate this to IPCC communications, because it seems a lot of what you're talking about would be handled by third parties outside the IPCC, and so for the purpose of this meeting, what falls on the IPCC from what you're saying? It seems to me that it's more something that the IPCC deals with in advance, for instance through the FAQs, as people were saying. Personally, I don't see a role for the IPCC in engaging with misinformation about climate science in blogs and things. I don't think we're set up to have that kind of discussion with people. If I see misinformation or misunderstandings about the way the IPCC works, factual misinformation in social media or in the media, then we would respond to that. But we wouldn't. I don't think we would get engaged in a discussion about climate science. I mean, the proper place for that is our reports and press conferences and so on. But maybe in the breakout groups, that's something that people could discuss. And perhaps if we're looking at including a heading off misinformation in reports through the FAQs, for instance, maybe how do the author teams become aware of what the potential misinformation is? So maybe that's another case where we need communications experts or other experts who can feed into the author teams at an early stage in the reports. But that might be something for the breakout groups to consider later. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, John.